Welcome to the Fantasy Champions Fantasy Football Podcast. Here's your host, Morgan Colby and Rick Lemon.
What's going on, Fantasy Champs? My name is Morgan Colby. Rick is not with me today. He's not with me today on this episode. He will be with us for the mega Thanksgiving preview show that we're going to do, breaking down all the Thanksgiving matchups and giving you some fantasy advice on how to approach those matchups. So it should be a very interesting, very fun show. Be sure to check that one out. But before we jump into that episode and Thanksgiving and all of the great things that come with that, let's break down week 11 because that happened. It was a very interesting week, very interesting matchup. Some very interesting matchups. It actually kind of was terrible football all around in terms of the actual football on the field. But hopefully you got your win in fantasy football. Hopefully you had some good performances and things went well for you. And I'm going to break down this week, going through the booms and the busts. And then we'll talk about some waiver wire pickups that you can have for this week as we move into week 12 and we get closer and closer to the fantasy playoffs beginning. Before we do that, check out our website, fantasychampions.com. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok. If you're watching on YouTube, subscribe, click the bell for notifications, like and comment down below any questions you have for us. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or any other podcasting platforms, please leave a review, share this pod with your friends, and be sure to make sure your friends know about the podcast. Share it. Don't let us be a secret. I mean, you want to win your league, so maybe you're holding that secret away. Who knows? But anyway, all right. So without further ado, let's jump into, I'm going to try to make this a quick episode for y'all and go through all this information as fast as possible. We'll start with the booms and the busts, and we'll go through some different things. Number one, we got Trevor Lawrence, who had 32.2 fantasy points this week. So he puts up a really good performance on the season. T-Law really hasn't had a good season. And finally, we get a really good performance out of him. Maybe that means he's going to turn it around. I don't know. But he's had, he's the QB 16 on the season. So he hasn't really had too much of a prolific season in terms of fantasy football. He hadn't even had a 20-point game until this week where he had 33.78. So when you talk about Trevor Lawrence and where he's at, 262, 2 touchdowns, had a really good week, won a really big matchup against Tennessee in a game they needed to have a bounce back, has a really good performance. Excited to see what Trevor Lawrence does down the stretch. He has Houston, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Baltimore, Tampa Bay, and Carolina left in the season. The playoff schedule is tougher outside of that Carolina matchup in Week 17. So, with Trevor Lawrence, it'll be interesting to see how things go, but you want to see him take steps to improve before you get him back into your starting lineup, because there was a lot of feelings, like Rick even, I think, said a couple weeks ago that he might even be droppable. I felt as though he needed to be rostered, but you needed to just sit and wait instead of starting him on a week-to-week basis because it was just going to burn your team. So he finally gets a good performance and puts himself back into contention here. Brock Purdy at 26.7, so that continues a streak of really good games for Brock Purdy. He's the QB 9 on the season, so he's been performing well. And then we have Justin Herbert, who has 25.7 fantasy points, so he gets exactly what he needs or what you need for fantasy football this week, and performs exactly how you would anticipate him to. Some busts this week. Genos was Joe Burrow first, 8.7. He did get hurt his wrist. He is going to be done for the year. So the only reason why he didn't perform well this week was because of the wrist injury. We have Geno Smith, who had 13.2. So I think he was on the sit list this week for Rick or I. I can't remember which one of us had him as a sit, but he did not perform well this week with 13.2 fantasy points. So, he continues to disappoint from a fantasy perspective on a week-to-week basis if you keep rolling him out there. And then Russ had 14.5 fantasy points. So he's actually been really good on the season. And this game kind of collapses a little bit the situation for Russell Wilson in terms of if you rolled him out in your lineup and you started him, obviously that was a bad situation for you. So those are the quarterback busts of the week. Let's chat about some of the running back booms we had. Saquon Barkley dropping a 30-piece. Now, there were situations where I was thinking about possibly putting Saquon Barkley putting Saquon Barkley in the starting lineup for me. Not in the starting lineup. There's thoughts for me to trade for Saquon Barkley in our home league. And I was like, you know what? The Giants situation scares the crap out of me with, having Tommy DeVito as the starting quarterback and how the offense has looked really crappy. Like things are not really gone well for them. And I don't anticipate Saquon being a really good, fantasy asset moving forward. You might have some boom games, but he had a really good game this week with 30 fantasy points, leading all running backs in fantasy football. So he can still perform even though his team sucks. And I think Tyrod Taylor coming back might just be what he needs in order to start having a little bit more success consistently on a week-to-week basis. So I'm excited to see where Saquon kind of goes. He might actually be, before your trade deadlines, though, a really good trade asset, and you can kind of ship him away in a sell and try to get some assets for him because he has the name value and he just scored 30 points and all of that stuff. So, you can maybe deal him and get something good for him before, the end of the season comes where things aren't going well. But Barkley has a good week. Jaylen Warren is slowly taking this job away from Najee Harris here. He ends the week with 23.5 fantasy points. And I think he's gotten the start 2 weeks in a row now. He only had 45% of the snaps, but he had 9 carries for 129 yards and a touchdown. He also had 3 catches for 16 yards to add on top of that. The big thing with Jaylen Warren at this point is, how many weeks in a row does he continue to have success before the Steelers have to look at him as a possible option to get more work over Najee Harris, who hasn't been efficient? Because if that time comes, then Jaylen Warren, really has become a hot commodity here at the end of the season, and things might shift in a positive direction for fantasy teams who have Jaylen Warren. So keep an eye on that situation, but Warren gets 23.5 this week. And then Jahmyr Gibbs, 4th straight game with 20-plus points. I talked to Rick about it on our Thanksgiving show that you'll see tomorrow, but he's the RB2 over the last 4 games that he has played. So that would be 5 weeks, one with a bye week, and he has just been a monster. He's the RB2 in that stretch of games. If they continue to give him the opportunity and work, I think he'll continue to show he can be a really good running back in fantasy football. All right, let's move to the wide receiver booms and busts that we have. Actually, I didn't even talk about the busts at the running back position. Devin Achane, really quickly, 1.5 fantasy points. He got hurt in this game. Kenneth Walker was at 2.6, but he also got hurt in his game. So these two guys don't produce in fantasy, but they also sustained injuries. So they didn't really super bust this week, but they were players you probably had in your starting lineup that did not perform well. Aaron Jones, also another running back, 2.7 fantasy points, got hurt this week as well. His injury doesn't sound too serious. So it was initially thought that he tore his ACL, but now it sounds like he might be out just for a couple weeks. I don't know. Keep following that situation before you drop him. As far as Achane and Kenneth Walker, Achane looks like he re-injured his knee, so keep an eye on that situation as well. And then Kenneth Walker had an oblique strain, so it sounds like he's going to be out probably 1-2 weeks, maybe 3. But we'll see how that situation. He's doubtful for Thursday Night Football, so it's unlikely that he plays this week. As far as the wide receiver booms, we have Calvin Ridley, who had 31.1. So Ridley has, to me, by far been the biggest disappointment in fantasy football on the year. You know what I mean? He's a wide receiver 27, and week 1 he had 23 points, but after that he had 5, 7, 11, 26, 1, 14, and 4. Finally getting a really good performance and catching 2 touchdowns. The first touchdowns he has caught since week 4 of the NFL season. So he has been a dude that has really not been consistently producing on a week-to-week basis for your fantasy team, and it's been a kind of a struggle bus. Only 32% of leagues and sleepers started him this week. And so, only 30% of you guys got to experience the 31-point game. Funny part is that the guy I was playing in my home league happened to be one of those 30%. So Calvin Ridley obviously, gets a really good performance. He's got Houston coming up this next week. So maybe he can start building upon that big performance and continue to perform. I don't know that I would run and chase after the points of the 31 and be like, okay, I'm just going to start him this week. I kind of want to see him do it again, just to confirm that I am willing to start him. But I like Calvin Ridley moving forward, and I think there's some positive things here. If he was on a buy low list for you and you had the opportunity to get him, it's probably over at this point in terms of the buy low. So Calvin Ridley had 30. Tyreek Hill, once again, he's the wide receiver 1 on the year. He's probably going to finish as the wide receiver 1. He's probably one of the biggest league winners because, once again, Tyreek Hill did not go as the wide receiver 1 in fantasy football. He scores 30.6 this week, so he does what Tyreek Hill does, and he continues to be the wide receiver 1 in fantasy football. Tank Dell is slowly becoming a breakout asset. He had 28.9 this week, but taking a look at Tank, he is an interesting player. And the reason why I say he's interesting is because he, over the last 3 weeks, 29, 18, 28, he has been explosive. He's been getting a ton of targets. He's one of my trade targets. If I can get him on my team, I will try my darndest to get him. Because I think there are things coming for Tank Dell that are just explosive if he continues this pace. This breakout down the stretch could be, if he continues to perform against teams like Jacksonville, Denver, New York, Tennessee, Cleveland, Tennessee again, if he continues to perform and have really good games down the stretch here, Tank Dell could realistically be an Amon-Ra St. Brown-like breakout in the second half of the season, just based on what we've seen from week 9 on. So, I want to see him continue to have success. He's wide receiver 16 on the season so far. He's already had some really good performances. He missed, week 6 and then the bye week. And then to start the season, he had 6, 20, 25, 2, and 8. And he's really been getting a lot of targets after the bye. So I like to see that for Tank Dell. Really positive situations for Tank. But I'd try to get him on my team if there's a way to do it, because I think second half breakout, it's coming. Bust this week, we had Garrett Wilson, who had 0.9 fantasy points. I believe he was limited in this game, but the Jets just had a terrible, terrible, terrible performance. Bad offense. No, he wasn't limited at all. He had 95 snap percentage, so he just completely busted for your team. He was terrible this week. Cooper Kupp had 2.1, but he did get hurt in the game, so he's probably going to miss some time. And then Stephon Diggs, 2 weeks in a row now, around 6 fantasy points, has not really been performing well. So keep an eye on that. I don't know why that's been happening or what the situation is, but it makes me slightly nervous. Booms. At the tight end position, we got George Kittle at 22.9 fantasy points. He's been a monster. He has been a demonstrative monster in fantasy football over the last couple weeks. I think he's 3 straight weeks with 20-plus fantasy points, so he's been really, really, really good. But he is boom or bust in a lot of ways, so we'll see what happens moving forward. But good performance for him. Josh Oliver, tight end position, by the way, terrible this week. A lot of guys scoring the same amount of fantasy points, around 9, 10 fantasy points. Josh Oliver gets 14, so don't anticipate that happening moving forward. David Njoku gets 12.6, so he's been right around where he was, but he's the tight end 3 on the week. We still have yet to see Travis Kelce play and Dallas Goedert, so things like that could change because I'm recording this on Monday, but we'll see what happens. The tight end bust this week, Mark Andrews at 4.3, but he got hurt. They're holding out hope that he can play at some point again this season, so just slap him in your IR spot, but it sounds like he's going to be done for a little bit. Cole Kmet had 5, so if you started him, you got a bust there from Kmet. And then Logan Thomas had 8.8, so that was one of your lower busts. Like I said, all the tight ends really got around 8, 9 fantasy points on the week. So was an interesting week. But those are your booms. Those are your busts. Let's jump into what you've been waiting for, what you saw in the title, which is the waiver wire portion of this show. And it should be interesting. We love to head over to Sleeper and look at the trending tabs just to see in redraft leagues where things are trending, what guys are getting picked up, what guys aren't. And we'll start with the quarterback position. And I'll give you some different guys. I'm not interested in Jake Browning. He's been picked up in a lot of leagues as a quarterback for Cincinnati. He is, he hasn't really had any opportunity in his career. This Sunday, he had 11 fantasy points, so he was 8 of 14, 68 yards and 1 touchdown. And then he also had 40 rushing yards in the game as well. So he had 11 fantasy points. I think, people are kind of looking at Jake Browning going, okay, this guy's going to get the opportunity, but I just don't see how there's going to be, he has Pittsburgh, one of the better defenses in the NFL in Pittsburgh. Then he has Jacksonville, and then he has Pittsburgh again in KC to end the season. So there's really only 2 games that I would even consider starting him here, against Indianapolis and Minnesota. And even those games aren't great. So for me at this point, Jake Browning, not a good play this week. Not a good play at all. I wouldn't pick him up. I don't think it's worth it. Let your league mates deal with that. Tim Boyle, for the New York Jets, he is now assumedly the starting quarterback for this team, and the Jets are going to run with Boyle moving forward. So he's been picked up in a lot of leagues. I don't see this guy being good at all. He also played this week. He was 7 of 14 for 33 yards and threw an interception. So I just don't think Tim Boyle's going to be the dude moving forward, and he's going to be terrible. So it's not worth picking up at this point. That guy, if you're taking a look at him. And then Joe Flacco was also picked up by the Browns practice squad, but I don't anticipate him playing at all, so I wouldn't pick him up either. So those guys, just stay away from him. It's not worth it. Tommy DeVito did have a good week this week, where he had 25 fantasy points. I don't anticipate things like that happening as you move forward. So, I mean, we'll see what happens. He threw 3 touchdown passes, 246 yards. He had a really good game, but I don't think there's much there. So he's another guy that I would avoid picking up, especially when he has next week New England, and it's like, maybe you want to start him against New England, but I don't know. I don't think that's a good idea. Bill Belichick against rookie quarterbacks usually stuns them in some way. Guys that I would pick up right now, rostered in 51% of leagues, Russell Wilson. He did have a tough week this week, but I'd pick him up. He's QB 14 on the season. He's a good guy to have on your bench, so it's worth grabbing him if you can get him. Outside of that, I'm not really seeing a lot of guys that I'm super intrigued by. It sounds like Ritter's going back to being the starter after the bye week, so maybe you want to get him, but those are the quarterbacks. Let's talk about some of the running backs that you can grab this week. I think the number one ad obviously has to be Zach Charbonnet. They do have a tough schedule down the stretch at the end of the season, but if Kenneth Walker does miss extended periods of time, like he misses 2-3 weeks, you're going to want Zach Charbonnet on your team, because I do think that he is, Kenneth Walker's a really good running back, but I don't think he's anything generational. So I think, Zach Charbonnet can really have a good week this week. And build on that. You want to make sure that's on your team. So I would get him. I wouldn't dump a ton of waiver budget to do it, but just put a claim in on him, put a little bit of waiver budget on him, see what you can get for him. AJ Dillon owned in 61% of leagues, so I'd pick him up as well, but he's probably not available. People have been running to the waiver wire to go pick up Ty Chandler after he had 15 points this week. 4 catches, 37 yards, 10 rushes for 73 yards, so he had an efficient week. And they gave him a lot of opportunity. So, heck, the things in the backfield for Minnesota haven't been good. If you want to take a shot on Chandler, feel free. Not wasting a ton of waiver budget on it, though. Outside of that, not a ton of running backs that are going to be available for you in terms of what things are trending. Obviously Jaylen Warren, Devin Singletary should be owned, but they're rostered in 78% of leagues. So, you're not going to be able to get those guys. So lots of opportunities here for the running back position. But let's take a look at, actually, there's one more interesting one. Actually, no, I'm not going to say that. Gus Edwards, if he's available, take a look. 79% of leagues, though, so he's not available most likely for you. Some guys that I would pick up, Jaden Reed. He's owned in 43% of leagues on Sleeper. So if you have a good chance, almost a 50% chance of getting Jalen Reed, or he's available in your league. So I would run out, try to acquire Jalen Reed on the waiver wire. I think he's probably my number one ad this week. He does play the Lions this week, who are a tougher matchup, but he's a player that has been, for the most part, I think he's wide receiver 32, so he's been a guy that you can actually play in your flex at certain moments on the year, and I think you need that at this point when you're talking about bye weeks and other things happening. As we conclude some of these bye weeks here at the end of the season, Jaden Reed's a good addition. Odell Beckham is getting rostered, and getting picked up in a lot of leagues right now. And it was probably because he had 15 fantasy points this week. In the last 3 weeks, he's had 14, 11, and 15. I'd stay away from him. I don't think there's anything there for Odell Beckham. I think he's a corpse of his original self, and I don't think there's you're just, it's a fool's errand. You're just chasing name value at that point. So I'd avoid him. Khalil Shakur had 20 points this week. He had 115 yards and 3 catches, but he only had 4 targets. So he is a boom play, and he's had some good games in a boom scenario, but he doesn't get enough volume to really warrant a good pickup. So Shakur is not a guy that I love either. I'd rather pick up Rondale Moore if you were going to pick up a guy, but even he didn't have a great week. He only had 1 catch. He did have 8 targets the first week with Kyler back, but he only had 1 target this week, so not great things from him either. If you don't have Tank Dell on your team, like, he's owned in 80% of leagues, so probably taken, but I'd take a look at Tank Dell if he's on your waiver wire. I'd dump everything that I have for Tank Dell if he's still on your waiver wire. But outside of that, there's not a lot of wide receivers that I'm really taking a look at. Somebody that's been getting a lot of target share when available is Zay Jones. He was a limited participant this week, and he only had 4 catches for 20 yards. But because he gets so many targets when he's on the field, like 6-7 targets a game, I would maybe try to roster him. But outside of that, not a lot of guys at the wide receiver position that you can acquire at this point. Pretty low totals. Moving to the tight end position and the final position, Isaiah Likely has to be your number 1 waiver wire add this week. With Mark Andrews basically done for the year, Likely slides into that role. I don't think he's going to get as many targets because he's not as good as Mark Andrews, but I do think he's going to get opportunity. And because of that, you want to just at least take a shot on him and see what happens, because if he starts getting that opportunity that Mark Andrews got, then Likely is going to be a really, really good pickup for you later in the season here if you want to try to acquire that guy. Outside of that, there's not a lot of guys. Donald Parham has been a guy that people have been talking about. He's been picked up in a lot of leagues, but I'm not really a huge fan of that. I guess the number 1 tight end pickup is Isaiah Likely here, so you want to keep an eye on him. In terms of some guys that are being dropped right now, let's go through that list really fast, and then we'll end the show. I have a little bit of time, so I'll give you some extra content. But trending down right now on Sleeper, you have Joe Burrow. Obviously, tore a ligament in his hand, so he's most likely going to be out for the season here. So he's a guy that you can drop. Mark Andrews in that same boat. He's a guy that you're going to dump off your roster because he's hurt and he's probably done for the year. I would say they're making it sound like he might be able to come back, so I would put him on my IR slot instead of dropping him immediately. But if you want to drop him because you don't have a spot on your roster, then it's fine to drop him because I don't think he'll be back by the fantasy playoffs. So you have the Quentin Johnston had a big drop this week, so he's on the down list because of the drop. He had 6 targets and only 2 catches in the game. Hasn't really produced that much in fantasy football, so it's fine to drop him if you want to. Rico Dwaddle, I've noticed, has been getting dropped in a lot of leagues as well. This week he had 8 carries, 23 yards, 2.88 yards per carry, so he's been god-awful. Hasn't been good at all, so Dwaddle can go if you want to drop him. I'm going to drop him in my leagues. And then I told you Nico Collins is back. He's still got good target share. I would hold on to Noah Brown, though. He missed this week against Arizona. He's probably going to miss 1 to 2 weeks, but he had a really good performance. So like if he's out, just stick him in your IR slot and hold on to him for now. I wouldn't cut him unless it's entirely necessary. Outside of that, just keep chugging away. Keep chugging away on the waiver wire. But there are your waiver wire ads for this week. There's your booms and busts for this week. We do have a Thursday Thanksgiving mega preview show that you're going to want to take a look at coming up on the next episode. So be sure to check that out. Thanks for listening, guys. Go get you guys on the waiver wire, and let's get Week 12 started. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Fantasy Champions Podcast. Make sure you subscribe on iTunes and YouTube, and follow us on Twitter @TheFFChamps.